Well, hello and welcome. Welcome, people who are watching online, and welcome, Roger Nober. I'm Josh Kosman. I'm a senior correspondent at the Capitol Forum, and we're very pleased to be joined by Roger Nober, who has a very distinguished career in rail, and will talk to us about the proposed Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern merger. You're right now a professorial lecturer at George Washington, and your past includes being the chief legal officer and EVP at BNSF, as well as being the chair of the Surface Transportation Board from 2002 to '06. One thing we want to be clear with people who are watching is, Roger, are you still doing work? And we talked about this before at BNSF.
I am. Since January, I've been doing some work with them. So, in full disclosure, I am a consultant to them, although I promise that my opinions are my own.
Sounds
But
good. Sounds
as they
good.
were when I was at BNSF too.
All right, that's awesome. And certainly being the former STB chair, and interestingly, being the first chair, as we'll talk about, when they enacted the enhanced competition rule, which to me seems to be the key of whether this merger goes through or not. Maybe a place to start is on April 30th, Union Pacific reapplied for the merger after getting rejected the first time. It's a lot of pages to go through, but now it's been a couple weeks. Roger, what do you think of the submission? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, it's first of all, thank you for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about rail regulation and rail mergers. What I would say at the beginning is, just to put it in context, a rail merger, unlike, most major mergers, still goes through an independent agency, the Surface Transportation Board. And, whereas the average transportation merger would go through the Department of Justice and, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission split up different industry sectors, and transportation as justice. They've maintained rail mergers through the STB. And to show how old I am, back in the day, the original independent agency was the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the STB is a successor to that. And it was eliminated, so to speak, in the mid 1990s, and I was the lead House staffer on the bill to eliminate it and create the independent agency. And the reason it was kept as independent was to review rail mergers, because they create a market concentration, or at least the feeling was that really can't be looked at through traditional antitrust principles that justice might. So, that said, there were a number of rail mergers back in the 80s and 90s to consolidate the myriad of Class One railroads at the time and create larger scale, more efficient operations. And starting in the late 90s, the then chairman of the first and then chairman of the STB, Linda Morgan, felt that mergers needed to slow down. Ironically, Union Pacific was one of the leaders of opposing at the time there was a proposal for Burlington Northern to merge with Canadian National and create what would be sort of a quasi-transcontinental railroad. And the agency put forward a merger moratorium in the late 90s and then spent 2 years redoing its rules to create what are quote unquote the new merger rules, which were finalized and promulgated in 2001. So the question really is, and they really created a more significant hurdle for rail mergers. And in the past, the measure of that the agency would look at was, were you preserving competition? And by that, they typically meant rail to rail competition. So shippers who you could only utilize rail. And the new merger rules put a standard in that said you had to enhance competition. But it left it a little flexible as to what exactly enhanced competition meant. Now, I was going through the confirmation process a few months after that. And in fact, I recently looked up, I was asked about this at my confirmation hearing back in 2002. And I looked up my answer, and it was, again, not to the extent that anything that I said is dispositive. It was it said that there was a very high hurdle to a new merger, although it didn't necessarily mandate that enhanced competition needed to be enhancing competition among rails. And we can talk a little bit about what that means. So, really, over the last 25 years, there had been no Class 1 mergers. And interestingly, in the 2001 merger rules, there was an exception of the application of those to a transaction involving, at the time, the smallest Class 1, Kansas City Southern. And back in 2000 and 2022, Canadian Pacific put in a bid to buy KCS, and it was done under the old rules. There was a competing bid by Canadian National that was under the new rules, and it was rejected. At least the initial step was rejected by the board under the new rules, but accepted under the old rules. So there's a little bit of precedent that the new rules are more stringent. Now, you kind of fast forward to 2025, and there had been some chatter about a merger, and really, the chatter was pretty soon confirmed by Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, and they announced in the summer of 2025 that they intended to merge. And there's a number of sort of technical steps that have to happen, but the main one is you have to file an actual application, which has a large number of sort of regulatory requirements that be included in it, and documentation, evaluations, and it has to show many of the requirements of the new merger rules, including enhancing competition, something called downstream effects, which is really in an industry with sort of four carriers that control in the United States over 90% of the traffic. What would the impact of one merger be on the other carriers, and what would they do in response? And we can talk about that a little bit as well, along with really estimates of what the rail traffic is going to be. And so that was originally, the application was filed in December 18th, I think, of 2025, just before Christmas. And then the board has a process where interested parties can weigh in. There were a number of parties that weighed in and said that the application was deficient in certain areas, particularly on its traffic analysis, and how it treated a terminal railroad, which again is a term of art. We can talk about that in a little bit as well, and how it treated some of its merger agreement. And 30 days later, the board didn't accept it, which is not in and of itself a shocking development. It happens all the time that in applications, the STB, usually they're minor, so it's not something that takes on great significance, but they're sent back for supplement and more information, and that's what happened here. UP, of course, said that they were going to refile. They did, and they filed on April 30th. And that sort of brings us to where we are today, which is what's in the application and how will the agency look at it. And we are essentially 15 days out of the 30 that the agency has to look at it. And last week, the other, parties had to opine on whether they thought the application was correct. And there were a number of filings that suggested it wasn't. UP filed their response on, I think it was Monday, and to no surprise, they suggested that it was in fact complete, and now it's really up to the agency to decide. And so that's sort of the procedural posture that we're in.
And what
Um,
do you think, Roger? I mean, you've had a chance to
well,
review it. What is your take?
I mean, I think that UP's strategy in this has been to propose the minimum. And and so the initial application, they proposed the minimum. They really had very little in the way of enhancing competition, and most felt that their program to enhance competition was essentially maintaining competition. And they were very scant on the traffic data that they showed and some of the technicalities that econometric the econometric consultants looked at. This one, they say they've corrected it. Other parties have looked at it and feel that they haven't. I initially would have said I couldn't believe that they would have submitted something that didn't meet the test, but after reading the other concerns, I now have questions. So I don't know whether the board will consider it complete. I
And
think it's
how
probably.
important, Roger, if they reject it a second time, there's three members of the STB, two
Mhm.
Republicans and a Dem. They unanimously rejected it the first time.
Correct.
If they were to reject it a second time, how important do you think it is that they would reject it a second time?
Well, from a there's there's a lot of different ways to look at that, Josh. I'd say the first step from a purely legal standpoint, they'd be in the same position they are now, which is they could go back and look at what was missing and hopefully this time take it to heart and file it. But from a, that's from the legal sort of technical regulatory standpoint. From the, mergers though are not just legal evaluations. They have a political component and they have a market component and they have a public component. And one of the real sort of strengths of this merger had been the seeming momentum toward it, that UP had been very effective over the summer and during the year of creating an aura of momentum behind their merger, that this was going to happen. And that has a number of effects, which we could talk about in a minute. But the main one is that when you have if stakeholders, so shippers, public transit agencies, rail suppliers, the sort of the rail stakeholder ecosystem, if you will, to use a overused cliche, felt that it's going to be inevitable and UP is going to be somewhere between 40 and 50% of the market, they're going to be cautious about how much they're going to want to complain. And as a phrase that's used often is poke the bear. But if the aura of inevitability isn't there anymore and people feel that there's a real chance the merger might not go forward, then that's going to embolden the stakeholder ecosystem to raise issues. And so the real impact of it is not so much the sort of legal delay, which is obviously a problem, but it's going to create an aura that it's not inevitable anymore. And that will bring more stakeholders out. It will bring more demands for concessions, and it will affect the shareholder and sort of financial base, which I've learned about in mergers. There's an entire world of traders who just trade on the speculation of whether mergers are going to go forward or not, the arbitrageurs, if you will, and trying to gain something from the spread, and how they view this will start to take on much more significance. And it's sort of like its own, each merger has its own sort of prediction market, if you will.
No, no question. So, and when will they likely come out with their decision, whether to accept the application or not?
I would say certainly in the next, call it 2 days, 14 to 15 days. 15 would be the maximum. And maybe it'll come out a day or two before that. Maybe it won't. I'd say a wild card, Josh, is that one of the members is a potential new member, a Republican member, um, is just was it a package of nominations that went through cloture. And if his name is Richard Closter, Dick Closter, and if he's confirmed, he could be sworn in before the board votes on this, and then how the agency would deal with that, give him whether it would give him a chance to look at it or not, or how that would go is going to be, up to the chairman. And really the chairman is somebody who is very, in my experience, Chairman Fuchs is somebody who's extremely considerate of his fellow board members. It's an agency that really brings it's a throwback in terms of its collegiality and cooperation. Now, the members don't always agree on things, but in terms of cooperating and working together and not being politically divisive, the agency really it stands out in that way. And so I think Chairman Fuchs will be sensitive to that. Now, what he does is going to be a function of things that are out of his control, right? Because he has a statutory deadline to rule, and Dick Kloster's nomination is at the hands of the Senate, and we all know that is impossible to predict.
No question.
I would also like to just note one more thing about the
Sure.
board, Josh, which is that, and I'm not sure this is true, but I have heard this, and I have no reason to doubt it, that President Trump just this week renominated the Democratic member Karen Headland. And I have heard that she is the first Democratic member that this administration has appointed to any independent agency or commission. So that's notable about how people view the agency and its nonpartisanship. So it's a real if that's true, and even if it's not true, it's a real testament to Commissioner Headland, who's somebody who I hold in the highest regard, and somebody who's is a the board is a better place for her being there.
Yeah, it's interesting. And just because people, why would they necessarily know? You were appointed by President Bush, so you were appointed by a Republican. Um,
Yes, I was. I was a Republican chairman, but interestingly, in the day, Linda Morgan, the Democratic chairman under Clinton, was kept on for almost 2 years until I was confirmed as chairman. And they did not name the sole Republican. They waited for a new one to come on because, again, you don't see typical partisan lines drawn in transportation in general and in regulatory matters in particular.
well, there's a lot of we want to cover in the next half an hour-ish. But let's talk about enhanced competition.
Sure.
You were confirmed when
Hmm.
this just became the rule. It really hasn't been tested, I believe, until now.
It has not been tested, no.
So you were mentioning that some believe that this merger would maintain competition, but perhaps not enhance competition. What do you see in the application, and do you think it answers the question of, are you enhancing competition?
So it's a really good question, and it's kind of the question of the moment in the rail industry. So, you have to go back and just again for context say enhanced competition compared to what? And what kind of competition are you enhancing? And typically in rail mergers, there's two kinds of rail traffic. There's really large volume, heavy haul traffic that are things like coal, aggregate, chemicals, mining and minerals, steel that are because of the nature of the supply chain, the size and the weight and the value of those commodities, and the inherent efficiency of steel wheels on steel rail. They are what are considered to be sort of rail captive or rail dominant, market dominant commodities, meaning that there isn't really another way of moving them effectively. You couldn't you have for grain unit trains of grain. So you have each rail boxcar is call it 3.5 or 4 trucks, and you can have 110 to 150 of them in one train. And so think about that. That's 400 trucks that would be driving grain or coal, and at the value of that, it just doesn't make any sense. So there's a regulatory scheme that looks at those kinds of commodities. And then there's the other half, which are really manufactured goods that are typically either manufactured in the US or overseas and go in containers. And we call that intermodal. And the sort of key characteristic is that they can go on a train or a truck. Doesn't really matter. And most of the time, but that's what intermodal means. It goes between modes, so it goes on both. And so when you say enhancing competition, typically as a rail regulator, you're concerned about the traffic that rails have, if you will, monopoly power over, that they don't have a choice. So farmers, power plants, industrial facilities like refineries and chemical plants. And that's where rail regulatory doctrines come in. And so when you say enhance competition, what folks probably meant in the question is whether they meant in the 90s, and what Linda meant was, did that mean enhancing competition for these market dominant sort of customers that rails have monopoly power over? And I would say that the sort of common understanding was that the answer was yes, that it was really meant to say that we don't want to create a national system, if you will. The idea back in the day was, well, our railroad's going to become like FedEx and UPS, and we're just two giant. There's two giant companies that serve all the addresses in the United States. The difference, though, between say a package company like FedEx and UPS and a railroad is that either of those two companies can go to any other address, right? They have trucks that can just show up anywhere. And with a rail, though, the individual companies own the rail. And so if you have a chemical plant or a refinery on one railroad, you can only use them. And so the question by enhancing competition, that usually means, well, is the regulator going to create a world where another carrier can operate over those tracks and access the shipper who's only served by one carrier. And I would say that in my, from 2000 and when I went to my confirmation hearing and when I was going through and for really most of the last 25 years, anyone, rail regulatory experts, rail management teams, and regulators, including myself, felt that enhanced competition meant not just maintaining what a railroad feels, a railroad's current competitive status, how many carriers each shipper was served each shipper, but enhancing that and allowing for each shipper to have more carriers. The way that it was really never thought of as intermodal per se, because it could go on a truck or a train today.
And
Now,
to be clear, what Union Pacific in this giant merger is arguing is we're going to take two-thirds of our traffic is going to be from trucks. We're going to
Mhm.
take traffic from trucks and move it on rail, which is intermodal, like you said,
Correct.
and is not the other half of the industry where there is no choice in the matter.
And so they haven't, and so what UP has said, and look, I can understand how they've argued this, is that we are enhancing competition because we are going to give intermodal shippers a better option to move things to take freight off of trucks and put it on rail because we're going to eliminate handlings, interchanges between carriers, and it's just going to go straight through. And think of it like if you're flying and you're flying from New York to Los Angeles and you have to stop in Denver. So you fly on Delta from New York to Denver and then change carriers and get on United, right? You have to go out, you have to go back through security, recheck in, as opposed to if you're just on one carrier and fly nonstop. So that's the analogy that they make is that they're going to be more efficient by taking out that interchange, if you will, and eliminating the
And just
handling.
for those who might be watching us who might not know, this would be the first transcontinental railroad. So they're
Correct.
connecting east and west.
And that it certainly is true that eliminating having one transcontinental carrier does make it easier to operate. But will it take as much time out of the system as they are speculating and reduce costs as much as they're speculating? That's a different question, and whether that will really happen. And some of it is the infrastructure as well. Do they have enough, to think of, again, using the airport analogy, to get containers on the railroad, you need a big intermodal yard that can lift the containers up off of trucks and put them onto rail. And then you need enough track capacity because intermodal movements have to go quickly. And the challenge is that for long haul intermodal movements that are cost sensitive, where the cost advantage of being on rail matters, they're probably already on rail. And so the things that aren't on rail now are ones that service reliability matters a lot. And and so for service to be reliable and competitive to truck, you need to have the infrastructure to make sure that trains can go at track speed, which might be 70 miles an hour. You need to be able to, get through congested areas quickly. You can't have service outages, and you need reliability as well as speed. And I think that there's a big question that's going to come up as we go into the merger process. Can this merger really deliver on those promises given what its operating plan is? But that's a little different than does it enhance competition? And
How do you think their enhanced competition arguments have evolved in the second application compared to the first?
well, they really haven't
Have they?
changed much.
Okay.
What they've done is it's they've really focused on the only competition that matters here is going to be truck to rail competition. And in fact, as we look at the market, this is, paraphrasing UP, we think the market for truck conversions even bigger than we originally thought. So there's even more potential for truck to rail competition. Now, I think a question for the agency is going to be is because look, taking trucks off the highway and putting them on rail is overall a good thing. right? To people who are drivers for pollution, because rail can take a ton of freight, 500 or more miles on a gallon of diesel. It's a pretty amazing efficiency. But is that enhanced competition or is that the public interest? And the regulator has to figure out is what they're going to do. Um, is what they're going to do to be able to, to the regulators' statutory mission is to protect rail customers who don't have competitive alternatives. And is this going to help or hinder that?
Roger, we just got a question from
Okay.
a viewer, and he asks if the merger allows Union Pacific to offer a superior product offering, isn't this the definition of being pro-competitive?
Well, I mean, that's certainly the UP view, and they can offer, if they can offer a superior intermodal product, that is a help. But again, you have to remember that there's an entire half of railroad traffic which doesn't have competitive alternatives. They're stuck on the railroad. And in essence, for a lot of reasons, a larger single line carrier makes them in some ways more captive and gives larger carriers more market power over them. And I'd say the other question that the regulators are going to have to deal with here is at what, when you create a carrier that has almost, if not more than, close to 50%, if not more than 50% of the market, at what point does it become too big to regulate? Because even if you put competitive conditions in there, can a regulator enforce them? And sometimes I use the analogy, I know I keep using aviation analogies, but to something like Boeing or Lockheed, which is at what point do private entities become too large to really regulate and the government becomes sort of a partner as opposed to a regulator at that point?
It's really interesting. We'll write about this soon. We found so at the DOJ, they're going to weigh in, even though they do not have final say. That's STB.
Mhm.
But they'll do a competitive analysis. And I saw in 2010 the Russ Pittman, who's still at the DOJ, did a whole paper about rails. And it's
Mhm.
pretty exhaustive, and there is a section on mergers. And he says basically a lot of what's going on right now, that the only mergers that would make sense would be transcontinental like this. And there could be efficiencies, but the issues would be is would it be too large? Would it dominate the industry too much? So he predicted a lot of this back in 2010, and it seems like a lot of it is playing out, right now.
And look, Russ is somebody who I've known for many years and brings a wealth of experience. Now, he has a particular point of view here. But that said, I mean, there really is the question, can you regulate um, service? Now, the other issue that a carrier like UP has is that, kind of their recent history. And you've seen a lot of sort of public debate about the UP CEO saying, don't judge us by history, judge us by our intent. But they've been what's called a precision scheduled railroad carrier. And precision scheduled railroading or PSR, the idea is to use the least amount of capital and infrastructure and assets possible to move something and do it on a scheduled, precise basis because it's easier to set your people, it's easier to maintain your track and to schedule movement in the most efficient way. And so PSR railroads, though, have generated a lot of revenue from price, particularly price on captive traffic. And so that is and what they've done is they've sort of forced shippers that don't have competitive alternatives to fit into their network. And that has been controversial, right? So if they say, well, you're only going to get service 3 days a week, you don't really have a choice, right? You're kind of stuck with that. And so that's going to be the question as to whether will they have so much market power on a transcontinental basis that they will be able to exercise too much market power over the captive customers. And it's going to be up to them to say so.
So a question that's been posed, and it's a good one, and it speaks to the political nature of what's happening. President Trump has said nice things about the Union Pacific CEO. Alliance Resource Partners, that represents part of the coal industry, and Peabody Coal, the biggest player, have come out supporting the merger. Not like last week, but since it's been
Mhm.
announced. How independent do you think the STB might be? And where do you think the president might be? Because now there has been some new opposition. Some Republican
Mhm.
AGs have come out against the merger, saying they have serious concerns. As you said, it does appear that the winds are shifting a little.
And, there was a coalition that was formed as well. And, Josh, it's a interesting question, and one that those of us in Washington who both study administrative law and follow independent agencies wonder about. On the tradition of the STB is that it is fiercely independent and technical and apolitical. So you've seen a lot of controversy involving independent agencies, the SEC and the Federal Trade Commission, for example, who have waded into national political issues, right? Using SEC regulation for climate disclosure, or, chilling of mergers and acquisitions in advance by the FTC and refusal to give any sort of, you know, staff advice. And that's never been the STB. So the sort of drivers of frustration with independent agencies have not really been things that have affected the STB in one way or another. It's something that is just not been. We just haven't seen that. Um, I'd say that this administration, though, has taken a unique view toward independent agencies. It follows what's called the unitary executive theory, which is that there's only one executive, which, considering that the president was a CEO, it doesn't surprise me he subscribes to that. That's how CEOs work, right? They think everybody works for them. So I understand the instinct there. I would say that they have in some cases fired independent agency people for cause, but in most cases they fired a number of independent agency regulators and dared them to raise the challenge before the Supreme Court, which they now have. And in my entire 30-year career of practicing administrative law and heading an agency and even creating an administrative agency, I'd never heard of the Supreme Court case called Humphrey's Executor, which basically allowed the independent agencies to only be fired for, it said that the president can't fire an independent person unless they're for cause, unless the Congress provides it. On the other hand, and I will tell you, when I was confirmed as chairman, I thought that that was the first and only time in my life I had job security. I thought, well, for the 5-year term, I have job security as long as I'm not causing mismal or nonfeasance or whatever it is. And of course, it was false consciousness on my part because there has been a desire to challenge that, and that's before the Supreme Court in a case called Trump v. Slaughter v. Trump or Trump v. Slaughter, and we should get an answer on that in the next 6 weeks. The general expectation is the Supreme Court will side with the Trump administration on this because of the growth of policy making at independent agencies. They're not roll up your sleeve regulators. So that's the backdrop.
And of course,
That said,
just throwing it in the unlikely chance that the Supreme Court goes the other way, then I would think one of the other Democratic commissioners who's not on the board now, Primus, he would be put back on the board, and that would change the dynamic of the board.
that would. So
It would
so
be
the the
2-2.
the president did terminate one of the board members, Rob Primus, who's somebody I've known for many years, and in fact, even had him speak to my administrative law class about independent agencies. But they did terminate him. He would go back on. At the same time, my experience, my observation about this administration is that regulators who roll up their sleeves and do the hard work of regulating are given wide berth here. And if there's one overall characteristic of Chairman Patrick Fuchs is that he is an absolute, he is he has a great intellectual curiosity and rolls up his sleeves and works incredibly hard and is not trying to create an independent sort of political base for himself. But again, he's just there to do the work of being a regulator. Now,
Do you think if the DOJ, because they'll rule first,
Hmm.
in the fall, likely. And not rule. Again, to be clear,
They'll just
the STB, it's just advisory. But when the DOJ gives its advisory opinion, many people think the DOJ is pretty much a direct arm of the president at this point.
mhm.
If the DOJ were to say, I have no idea what they will say. If you have any clue, please let me know.
I don't.
But if they were to say, you know, we think this deal should go through. It's going to take a lot of trucks off the road. Good deal for the environment. Hey, fuel prices are up. Probably a pretty good idea to move it to rail. If they were to approve the deal, how important do you think that would be? How much would it weigh on Fuchs?
Well, from the beginning, I think that, a couple of things. I think that the first is that, obviously the UP CEO met with the president in the fall or the summer and, had a picture from the Oval Office and the president said nice things. And now, was it because he liked the merger or because he wanted to send the National Guard to um, Memphis, and Jim had been on the board of FedEx and was strongly supportive of the National Guard. Who knows? I'd say I clearly the president's remarks reflected the president's views that day. Now, if there's one thing that we have seen with the first 4 years of the Trump administration and now a year and a half of the second Trump administration, it's that the White House is not firmly committed to any one particular policy, and it can be flexible in how they in their policy views. So, I mean, if you just look at the number of issues where the White House's view has changed over time, with more information coming out, with more more different circumstances. So I don't put the fact that they said one thing, 9 months ago as dispositive going forward. But to your other question, there's a big difference between saying I'm for the transaction and the hundreds, if not thousands, of details and conditions and individual assessments that would go into it. So I often say, when asked the question you asked, which is what do you think is going to happen? I'd say the question is, I don't think saying, do you think it's going to get approved is really the right question for the most part, although it might be. It's really, is what kinds of, are they going to approve something that the UP board is going to want to close on? Or will it have so many conditions that they feel it's not financially accretive going forward, as the finance guys like to say, people like to say, and
What
it's
do you
not,
think of
it's
the
not.
strategy? UP seems to be saying publicly, well, we won't close if we have to sell these rail lines. We won't
Mhm.
close if X. Like they seem to be signaling, or what do you think they are signaling? It's a little, strikes me as a little odd that they're signaling all this now.
I have not, I will say that I have not totally understood their strategy here, because I think the way I would characterize it is they've put in the minimum they could, and understand that when this proposal goes before the agency, if it's accepted and they evaluate it, that there's going to be conditions that are imposed. I feel like in some ways they're almost treating the agency as a counterparty, and that they're kind of negotiating back and forth and trying to put out statements that they want it to go as quickly as possible to kind of cut down on delay, if you will, and putting out statements that, we're going to walk away if you do too much. And, trying to send signals to the agency about what they will and will not accept. And, we'll see if that proves to be the right strategy. I just don't know whether or not that's going to prove to be correct, whether in the end they're going to get more or less. If there were one thing I think they wish they'd take back, it's probably submitting the application a week before the Christmas and New Year's holiday, and perhaps have taken a couple more weeks and not put the agency in that position. I wouldn't have advised them to do that, but they didn't ask what I thought.
No, probably not. So, as we're close to wrapping up, and Roger, thanks so much for your time. Um, what do you, and we should say, we did at the top, but to say again, you do some work for BNSF and we're
I
their chief
do.
legal counsel, and you also the chair of the STB and express your views, but just to lay out to our viewers,
That
your
is true.
potential biases. What do you predict will happen?
I would have said a week ago before I'd finished reading and read some of the responses, I felt that I would see it hard for UP to submit something that wouldn't they didn't have some signal would be accepted. Now I don't know that I'm not so sure about that. Um, I think that the what's missing are still issues that are out there, and I think one of two things will happen. I think they might accept it, but say, but you still have to supplement the record in these areas, which does happen. And one of the challenges here, again, this is just sort of an internal legal baseball, but um, once the application is submitted, there's a certain period of time for other parties to say, we think that there's a problem with this and we want a condition. And by putting zero conditions in, UP has now put those seeking conditions in the position of essentially having to prove they need one. So the burden of proof is subtly shifted onto those seeking conditions rather on the parties merging to prove that you don't need them because they've just declared we don't need them. And and I think the agency will be sensitive to putting other parties in the position of proving they need a condition. And the other thing that can happen is if UP feels that they need to put more evidence in response to what parties raise, they can put it in and the parties wouldn't have a chance to rebut it, if you will. So it would be kind of on reply and you don't have a chance to. So I think the agency will be sensitive to gaming out and not giving parties a chance to be able to reply to things. So I think whether they accept it or reject it and demand and say that you need to come back with X amount of materials or accept it, but say, okay, but now we're going to toll the statute to give you a chance to supplement it in these areas. I'm not sure. I would bet it would be one of those two, but I'm not positive of that.
And
And I
Roger,
think
what about the merger itself? Let's assume, just may not be the case. Let's assume they provide an application that the STB accepts. What do you think the timeline will be, and how do you think this might play out? The breakup fee is not huge for Union Pacific if they want
no, it's
to
not.
stay.
I think that UP has been clear about saying they won't do a merger at any cost. I'm not sure that that's the conventional wisdom, that the personalities involved are so wedded to it that they'll go forward. Now, whether or not UP's board would would halt it, I don't know. And it will be up to that. But the question is, and then can the agency craft conditions, which I think they're sensitive to, that will be, durable, that will be self-executing, and that will really address the competitive issues that come up. And so I think that that's going to be the question. Can you come up with conditions? Can the regulator come up with conditions that do that? In past mergers, over time, those competitive conditions haven't proven to be really effective, and that there are a lot of ways of frustrating them, which UP in general and Jim Venno, when he was both at CN and at UP, they know well how to do. And so I think that to me is the hardest thing, which is even if you felt there was some real benefit to it, could you craft conditions to address the inevitable competitive issues that market power that this new carrier is going to have in a way that is durable in the long run and not creating a long-term problem? Because remember, these are permanent. You can't undo it. And and that's the
Maybe along those
challenge.
lines, just because I know you're limited on time, and thank you so much for the time you've given. What do you think is the timing here for the ST, again, assuming there's an application that's
Mhm.
accepted? When would you think the STB would make their recommendation?
I think it is gonna, I tell everybody, and not to be glib, but bet the over. Because, as a matter of administrative practice, once the application the only thing that the applicant controls is the application. And once it goes in, now they're responding to other parties' evaluation of it. The board is then responding to both of those. And then they're going to have parties filing and asking for things, and they're going to be responding to those. So I think that I do think the agency will be sensitive to not, to the challenge of evaluating and commenting for parties on a matter of this size. And so I think that they will take time to do what they need to do. Now, it's not Patrick's style to go over statutory deadlines on the one hand. On the other hand, the agency has in the past told them for a reason, told to stop the deadline from going on to finish, to take for new information to come in. And so I think that the agency can and should take as long as it needs to get the information it needs here.
So you
And
certainly sounds like you think it'll take the company UP is saying second quarter 27. It sounds like you think
I'd be shocked if they got a final decision in the second quarter. I shouldn't say I'd be very surprised if it would, I mean, if this didn't happen till 28, I wouldn't be shocked. Right.
yeah.
So I would say second half of 27 on the early, would be what I'd be looking at. But I don't, because I just think there's so much here and there's a limited amount of bandwidth and the agency's not going to want to get it wrong. And even if the administration at a very high level says we think this is a good thing, that's different than the thousands of conditions that have to go into it.
And maybe a final quick question,
Sure.
because there are a good handful of Republican AGs who've expressed concern, including from South Dakota, which is the home of Senator John Thune, the majority leader. Um,
Mhm.
how much do you think they might weigh in further, and how much do you think that might matter? In a general DOJ case, they can sue. I don't think they can do that here, but you know better than I.
I think they could only challenge the final ruling, and but I'm not positive of that. I do think that the AGs, I think public officials weighing in always carries outsized weight. And what we haven't heard from many of the passenger agencies yet. We haven't heard from state AGs. And so I think all of that is to be determined because I think a lot of them are saying, well, why should I get involved in something that, until I need to? And so that will come from and the other thing is that a lot of rail customers may be reticent about raising their own voices, pardon me, but go to their state AGs or local officials and say, hey, can you provide air cover for me? And so you might see something like that happen as well. And it wouldn't shock me if something like that did. But I think that they typically do carry a lot of persuasive power, particularly the more broad-based they are. And I expect to see more, not less of that. And sometimes because I do think a very large carrier does have, size can be market power. And I don't mean to sound like Elizabeth Warren here. I promise I'm not. I was a Republican political appointee, but that is a reality when it comes to a network industry like railroads.
If this merger were to happen, how does it affect a company like BNSF, who is they would be number one and BNSF would be 1A if this merger happens?
I don't know what BNSF will do, and they haven't told me, and really it's going to be up to, see, you have to remember that BNSF is the largest segment of Berkshire Hathaway. And it's really what does Berkshire Hathaway decide what they want to do with their capital. And so, that's why the question here has come up to what has Warren Buffett or Greg Abel said. And so it's not, I don't know what they're going to do. And I can tell you when Warren's deciding what to do with capital, I can tell you who he's not calling.
All right. Any final
Even though
thoughts?
he's a great person and I've met him many times. And
Great, Roger. Anything else that you'd like to add?
no, just it's an amazing and interesting time in the rail industry. So it is it may not, I know there's a lot going on, and the fact that somebody like you and your publication is interested in the rail industry shows how momentous it really is. So there's to be determined.
All right. Great, Roger. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you for having me.